welcome him home with a lot of warmth and give it up for Fareed Zakaria.
Thank you so much. It is a great honor, pleasure, delight to be here. I'm really very grateful for this opportunity. It is a pleasure because Bombay is, of course, Mumbai is my hometown. And I still feel like I'm coming home, even though it's been 38 years, I think, since I left. But I still feel whenever I land, the smells, the sound, the sights all feel very familiar and bring back only warm memories. I feel that sometimes that I'm a relic from the past because my Bombay is a Bombay that in some ways has faded, but in some ways that's good. The country has marched ahead and moved on. And for those of us who call it Bombay and still remember the old sights and sounds and the fact that there was very little traffic, and when you went to the Hanging Gardens, there were 10 people in the Hanging Gardens and you knew 5 of them. That's a world gone by. I also want to thank the ABP for inviting me and to say that I think it's so important that India continue to have a vibrant, independent media. And in that context, I think the Sarkar family, my parents knew the current CEO's father very well, and the family's commitment to that has been an extraordinarily important part of having a free media. You know, we tend to think that democracy is kind of self-sustaining, but even in the United States, you saw over the last 5 years a really powerful assault on some democratic institutions, norms, practices. And one of the things that got the United States through that period, and it's not through it completely at all, is the fact that there was a press that was willing to be independent. And within that, it did turn out to be the fact that there were some institutions, media institutions, family-owned often or family-controlled, where people were willing not to be swayed by pressure and things like that. And so I really think it's a very important public service that ABP has provided for many, many years before it was called ABP, with the newspapers and such. And for somebody like me watching from the outside, wishes India well, cherishes Indian democracy. I want to say that we watch, we encourage, and we support an independent media, and all those of you who are trying to do it, sometimes facing some challenges. It's very important work. We all see it around the world. India is still regarded as a place where there is this extraordinary wonder of a country that is still a developing nation, huge population, and still has managed to maintain not just a vibrant democracy, but a vibrant democratic culture. And that part, I think, needs to be sustained. So thank you for inviting me, but also thank you for what you do. What I was going to do was talk a little bit, because I really would like to get into a conversation with all of you and with Veer Sanghvi, whom I think we were debating in the green room whether I met him when I was 12 or 14 at my father's house many, many years ago, and it's a huge pleasure. I've been a fan of his for many years. But before we get into that conversation, I just thought I'd lay out some ideas about what is happening in the world, because we really are living through profound changes in the international system. The Russian invasion of Ukraine, in some ways, is a more important event than 9/11, because it has the capacity to remake the global order in a way that 9/11 did not. 9/11, at the end of the day, was a band of terrorists who were able to disrupt the normal life of citizens around the world in a way that forced governments to react. And it was an event that was highly dramatic, highly symbolic, but ultimately it was a band of terrorists. It was a group of private individuals. And once they confronted the combined power of governments around the world, what we saw was ultimately they could be a nuisance, they could be a continual nuisance, they could occasionally disrupt things in ways that were somewhat more consequential than that. But they did not have the capacity to reshape the global order. But what we have going on now is the world's most powerful nuclear state, with a veto in the Security Council that spans 10 time zones, that is frontally assaulting one of the core tenets of the international system that was set up after 1945. And the question becomes, if that challenge succeeds in some sense, if that becomes normalized, what does the world begin to look like in that circumstance? And what will the consequences be, given that other great powers are going to react, or already reacting to that reality? So this is a classic case where size matters, power matters. The world of realpolitik has not gone away. What Russia is doing is important because of whom Russia is. As I tried to explain on American TV at some point, this is not because these people are white, it's because they are being attacked by a nuclear-armed superpower that has a veto at the Security Council. That is why this has the capacity to remake global affairs. If you think about it, the world we have grown up in has changed so much. I grew up in a world in India that was divided between the two great powers, East and West, and every event was judged on the basis of what was going to happen in that superpower context. So, civil war in Nicaragua, in Angola, anywhere in the world, and the frame, the prism through which we looked at it was the geopolitical lens of superpower rivalry, East versus West. And that world collapses in 1989, 1991, however you want to think about it. And what is ushered in is a new world that has been marked by really three defining trends. The first was globalization, which we all know, but consider how recent and how dramatic the change was. In the 1970s, when I was growing up in India, India was not in any sense participating in the global economy. It was shielded by high walls, high tariffs, high barriers to entry, capital controls of every kind. But it was not just India, of course. When you talked about the open world economy, you were talking about 15 countries. You were talking about Western Europe, the United States, Canada, and a couple of countries in East Asia. That's it. And from that small group of countries, you go in the 1990s to a world in which everybody is participating in some way or the other. Open investment, open trade, open communication. And that gets me to the second defining feature of that world, which was the information revolution. So if globalization brings everybody to the same, to playing the same game, to sitting on the same platform, the information revolution now hardwires it in a way that the speed is constant, only accelerating, connection is immediate, and that reality is the second great defining reality of the world we've lived in. But the third one, which in some ways was the condition that underlay all this, was great power peace. Peace among the great powers. This is a very unusual condition in human affairs. Most of the time, great powers are in conflict. And that conflict is the defining character of the relationship, because when security is threatened, everything is shaped by that sense of insecurity that you feel. A professor of mine at Harvard used to put it this way. He said, security is like oxygen. When you have it, you don't notice. But when you don't have it, you sure as hell notice. And that is the nature of basic stability and security in the world. You did not have great power competition of the kind you had during the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, the kind you had before that, World War II, World War I, and for 400 years prior to that, the European great powers in ceaseless competition and war. So 1990 till now has been a very unusual period where you have not had serious great power competition. And one reason you have not is one country loomed larger than all the rest and undergirded the system, So American power sat as the kind of engine that was powering this great power stability. And I'm not saying this as some kind of advocate of American power or foreign policy. I'm just describing a reality that there was no country, actually no combination of countries, that could challenge American hegemony. And that reality meant that you did not have this traditional great power rivalry that was taking place. If you think about it, who were the other powers? Russia. Russia, by the 1990s, was on its knees, weak, defaulting on its debt, desperate to find a way to restore basic living standards and basic law and order in its country. You had the countries of Eastern Europe, of Western Europe, which were essentially wholly dependent on the United States for their security. You had a country like Japan that, again, derived its security entirely from a security guarantee with the United States. This, by the way, is a very unusual situation in the world. If you think about it, in 1995, the second richest and third richest countries in the world, which would normally be the obvious competitors to the standing hegemon, were essentially satellites, security satellites of that hegemon. We've never had a situation like that before. And so this shaped the international environment in a way that what we began to think of as very normal was actually highly abnormal. Perhaps something that we have not seen since the Roman Empire, one country that dominant. What has happened in the last 10 years is you have begun to see an erosion of that Pax Americana. It's for a variety of reasons. Possibly the Iraq War is a way to start that discussion. Not just the turmoil that was caused, because after all, the turmoil was caused during the Vietnam War. But more than that, a sense that the United States had lost the will to try to reshape the world in the way it did. If you think about what happens after the Iraq War between second Bush administration, Obama, there's a sense of America withdrawing from the Middle East. And what you begin to see in the Middle East, by the way, as a result, is a kind of post-American Middle East, where the Saudis and the Iranians are jockeying for influence. The Turks and the Israelis are also trying to protect their identities. And in this great power or regional power competition, you get enormous chaos, civil wars in Iraq, in Yemen, in Syria, most bloody of all of it spilling over because you had, in a sense, developed a power vacuum as the United States withdrew and all these other countries, all these other regional powers jumped in. I say that only because I think in some ways the post-American Middle East might be a portend for what a post-American world might look like. So you have the Iraq War that perhaps plays this catalytic role. Then you have the global financial crisis, which has a larger effect than many people realize because it had the effect of delegitimizing American power. So if in the Iraq War shows that American military power is not invincible, the global financial crisis shows that the American economic model is not invincible. As the senior Chinese official very famously says to Hank Paulson, the American Treasury Secretary, he says, when they meet in the period right after the crisis, he says, Hank, we always regarded you as our tutors, Whenever we wanted to set up a new system, a regulation, a bank, central bank procedure, we would look to the Americans and ask how you do it. But now it doesn't seem like the tutor has anything to teach us after all. And that sense of delegitimization of American power, I think, is a very powerful part of this story. Now I think what you have for the first time really is a serious geopolitical challenge to that order, to that hegemony, with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I still describe it as a moment that is plastic in the sense that it can be shaped, because we don't know where it is going to go. What has surprised the Russians clearly is the extraordinary vibrancy and determination of the Ukrainians, but also the extraordinary vibrancy and determination of the West. And I use the West metaphorically because it includes Japan, Korea, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, even countries like Singapore that sometimes stay more neutral. Because it really is a kind of existential threat to this global system. And you can see a coming together of these countries to defend it. But I very much wonder whether we will ever be able to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. Remember that when people talk about we need a new world order, we need new institutions, we need new rules, remember how the last one came about. 1945, the United States has utterly destroyed the Axis powers, the United States and the Soviet Union, and it comprises something like 50% of global GDP by itself. Europe is flattened. The dollar is the only viable currency in the world. American financial power is the only viable financial power in the world. And it creates a world order that we've been familiar with ever since. We are never going to have a moment like that again. There is no country that is going to have that much power. There is no moment that is going to be so plastic and open that you can just reform the world in the way you want. So we are going to live in a very messy, complicated world in which, it almost be like an archaeological process where the old will stay, but new elements will be mapped onto it. So I do believe we are going to see a period of substantial deglobalization. I do think that when you take the 11th largest economy in the world and you essentially permanently, or not permanently, but in a highly effective way, remove it from the world economy, which is what is happening. And when that economy then starts trying to figure out how it is going to survive, which means that it moves into a Chinese orbit and will become essentially a Chinese vassal state, which the Chinese will welcome because it provides them with it's a classic colonial relationship. It provides them with raw material and energy in return for which they provide it with security. And that dynamic is likely to expand in various ways. That produces a kind of zone of its own. You will have the West, again metaphorically, in a zone of its own, and you will have this gray zone of countries trying to choose piecemeal whether they can really, whether they can have an a la carte menu into this world. And the Chinese and the Americans are going to say, no, it's a prefix menu. If you want economic protection, you have to accept the economic system. And the Chinese are going to say the same. But it's not going to work because the world is too complicated and too interdependent. And so everyone is going to be in a gray zone trying to navigate this world. We've gone from a world in which political risk was virtually non-existent to a world in which everything is being determined by political risk. Think about the transformation in the way in which economics has dominated politics for the last 30 years, and now politics is dominating economics. And I don't mean, and this is again, these forces have been coming together. It's not just happening in a country like India. It's happening in the United States. If you look at Joe Biden's economic program, a large amount of it is distressingly similar to Donald Trump's on this count. The protectionism, the Buy in America provisions, the tariffs that have been maintained on all kinds of countries and goods. If you look at the way in which people are talking about supply chains, resilience. All these have the effect of deglobalizing, creating regional supply chains, all of which, by the way, I'm not an economist, but have to be inflationary. Because what you're saying, what was globalization all about? It was saying we are going to find the most efficient way to source goods and services at the lowest cost. If you deglobalize, you are choosing higher costs, almost by definition. And so you are likely to see a world which is more divided, more fractured, more inflationary, with slower growth. Markets are going to be smaller everywhere. And so the question then becomes, how much political discord and division does this produce? Because remember, the world of the Cold War got stable after a period of fairly hair-raising series of crises in the 1950s and the 1960s, culminating in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Until then, there was an enormous amount of tension in the air as to what could happen. And we may be in a period like that, where these new orders are being formed. We still don't know how China will react with regard to Taiwan, or frankly, with regard to the Indian border. We still don't know what an isolated, cornered Russia will do with regard to perhaps all of Georgia, perhaps all of Moldova, perhaps the Baltic states, right? Imagine a world in which Russia has not a great deal to lose from further military aggression, because it's already cut out of the global economy. It's already cut out of the international system. And so that's the murky, suboptimal world I think we are moving into after 30 years of a very different kind of world. And I'll close with this because I know Veer and I are going to talk about this. The strange thing is that I actually think it provides India with some very unusual opportunities. Of course, there are challenges. Oil at $120 for a country like India is a hell of a challenge economically. But there are real opportunities for India going forward if it wishes to seize them. My own view is that India has not thought strategically about its place in the world for 20 or 30 years. It has really spent most of that time internally obsessed. To the extent that it has had a forward momentum, it has been around economic reform, but it needs to have a guiding national security strategy to position itself in a different space in the world, a much more powerful space in the world. But in order to do that, it has to make strategic choices. To say that you are multi-aligned is to say that you are not willing to make any choices. And anyone knows in life, if you're not willing to make choices, it means that you don't actually have a strategy. You are abdicating that fundamental role of national strategy. I believe India can have a national strategy. It should have one. It can be a very effective one. But it has to choose to do that and put in the time, make the choices, and do the hard work it would take. I'm an optimist in general. I'm painting the picture of a more complicated world. We'll all have to navigate this world, but I do believe we will be able to navigate it, and India in particular will be able to navigate it quite well. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Zakaria, for a very clear and incisive take on the changing geopolitical scenarios over the past many years. Would like to invite Mr. Veer Sanghvi now for a further Q&A with Mr. Zakaria.
Thank you, Fareed. That was quite brilliant, simply brilliant. Can I just say before we start, on behalf of everyone in this audience, particularly the people from Bombay, and I still call it Bombay like me, that when we see you on television, all of us feel incredibly proud. And I think it's Indians you make us proud. I think we may be shy to say this to your face, and I think most people in the audience agree with me, but I think it needed to be said, you've made India proud.
Thank you. Thank you.
So let's now pick up from where you left off. How do you think India has responded in this current Ukraine crisis? Do you think we've made the right choices? To the extent, as you would say, have we made any choices at all?
So I think in a short-term sense, India has made choices that were inevitable. Given India's reliance on Russia for essentially 80 to 90% of its advanced weaponry, it is very difficult to see how India could have an openly adversarial stance toward Russia. It may have been able to, do a few things here and there, and you could tinker with the policy, but basically, India is in a position where its national interests currently dictate a certain degree of engaged continual relationship with Russia, which would be very difficult were it to have taken a different stance. But the real question, Veer, is why are we in this position? And I say we now, using the license to be able to describe myself as part of India, wishing it well, wanting to see it do well on the world stage. For the past 20 years, it has been absolutely clear that this new world order that I've been describing is coming. These forces have been accelerated. God knows, I wrote a book in 2008 called The Post-American World, in which I talked about these. And it seemed to me then, and it seems to me still, that India is not grappling with the world as it is coming. The fundamental factor for India going forward strategically is the rise of China. And by the way, the rise of China is the fundamental geopolitical fact of the last 20 years, the next 20 years. This is the single largest emergence of a great power on the international scene in 200 or 300 years. Think about it. All the other great powers have been around for a while, right? This is the new great power on the block. It is going to cause seismic disturbance to the international system. What is India's strategy toward that? What is India's response to that? How is India thinking about where it should be? Simultaneously, what you are seeing emerge is the fracturing and fraying of the world I described into, broadly speaking, a smaller section of that world that one can call the free world. Open markets, open economics, open culture, open society. It seems to me that India, both from its head and its heart, should be asking itself, how can we buy insurance against China or toward China? And how do we align ourselves culturally, economically, politically with the world that clearly we have so much more in common than with the other parts of the world? Then with if you look at the 5 countries that voted with Russia, I can't remember who they were right now, but it was Syria, Venezuela, Iran, Russia, and North Korea, or something like that. Where is India, both in its head and its heart? And I think if India were to have spent time, Manmohan Singh began the process, and I can tell you when I would talk about this with him, he was deeply frustrated at how difficult it was to make this transition. And it never really got past him personally because the Delhi bureaucracy at every level, political and professional, is deeply resistant to these ideas of change, deeply resistant. You have people on the right who are resistant to it for their own kind of strange cultural nationalist reasons. You have people on the left who are opposed to it because they think Jawaharlal Nehru's speeches about Hindu Chini Bhai Bhai in the 1950s should be the governing ideology for the Indian Ministry of External Affairs. So you have a kind of strange combination of reasons why there is resistance to it. But here's the thing that always strikes me about India. Indian society is much more forward-looking than the Indian state. Yeah. If you were to ask yourself, where does Indian society want to be, right? It seems to me Indian society, Indian business, the average Indian person, they're all, their hearts and their heads are in that place. So why is in this great democracy, why is the Indian state not listening to Indian society?
You said that there are opportunities for India. What are the opportunities?
So the way I think about it, we're going to be in a world of slower growth, I think. in a world in which it's going to be defined by a series of shifts that have taken place. Deglobalization, without any question. The extent to it can be debated, but I do believe the Russian thing is a very big shift. So when people talked about deglobalization before, I would poo-poo it, I would downplay it, because by the way, US-China trade has been going up every month. It went up every month of the Trump presidency, for example. India's trade with China has been going up. Because beyond the rhetoric, people still wanted the actual interaction. Now you actually have government policy that is forcibly severing these relationships, sanctioning people that have these relationships. So it's a very different, now you have a kind of forcible repatriation, deglobalization, constriction of supply. And that I think is going to last because we haven't talked about this, but I should just signal, this conflict is not going to be easy to solve. And both sides seem to think that they're going to get a World War II style victory, absolute victory and absolute surrender. It's not going to happen, which means this is going to be very long and protracted. But if you ask yourself, what country looking around has advantages in this world? Well, if you're defined by deglobalization, you need a good, strong internal market, right? India has a very powerful internal market, perhaps the greatest internal market of any country with strong growth prospects, with a developing country. You also need a country that has good demographics. The other factor that is slowing down the world economy is just the reality of demographics. Demographics are bad everywhere in the Western world, and they're worse in China. So the great engines of growth are all entering a period of demographic decline, except for India. India has this extraordinary opportunity to find a way forward because of its young people. Finally, India does have the ability to arbitrage in this world. When I say that India should reorient itself in the way I was describing, I'm not saying become, the new Britain to America. I'm saying be canny and savvy about your interests, navigate and negotiate in a way where you are able to get the best of both sides. You will be able to play the two sides against each other. You will have to be anchored in one of the two fundamentally, and I tend to think that it makes much more sense for India to be anchored in the metaphorical West, to be wary of a rising China, to be getting insurance against it. But there are enormous opportunities from doing that. For the last 20 years, the United States has basically had a kind of open door policy toward India, saying, we will, starting with the nuclear deal, where the United States basically gave India everything it had been asking for 30 years, and in return the Indians were deeply suspicious and said, why are you doing this? There must be a new nefarious plot to recolonize us, right? The limitation has been India's willingness to move forward, to be active. But it has many advantages in this new world. And finally, and I think that this is an important piece, I believe India is going to be the site of the next tech revolution. If you think about what it takes to create a tech revolution, you need smart, technically trained people with good ideas. You need financing that's readily available, and you need a big market to which you have instant access. So far, we have had two tech revolutions: the United States, China. The reason, by the way, Europe has not had a real tech revolution is it has the first two conditions. It has smart, technically trained people, it has ample capital, liquidity, but it actually is not a single market. Europe is actually about 30 different national markets that are quite regulated. India is the only country in the world right now where all three conditions are satisfied, largely thanks to the fact that through smartphones, Indians are now connected and they are wired. So I think it is going to be the site of the next great tech revolution. And you put all that together, and it seems to me there's a fairly powerful set of advantages, even though the world is going to look a little different and perhaps is going to grow a little slower.
You talked about China and its role in the world. In India, increasingly we see China as the big threat. Is it, and how should we cope?
China is, without any question, the most important shift that has taken place in the geopolitical landscape. It is a country that is the most successful case of economic development in human history. I mean, the West industrialized at, roughly speaking, 2.5% per capita average over a long period of time. The United States averaged about 3%, which is why it became the richest country in the world. China has averaged, even taking into account the current slowdowns, about 9% a year for 40 years. This is unprecedented, and, in terms of moving people out of poverty, enormously commendable. But China is a very traditional country and a very traditional world power. So for those who are expecting China to rise the way that Japan or Germany did, remember how unusual those rises were. These are two countries utterly traumatized by their history in the 1930s, utterly defeated, and then utterly reconstructed along lines dictated and encouraged by the United States. So to imagine that China will rise and not want to have a political, military influence commensurate with that power, it would be to defy the laws of gravity. That is not going to happen. China is going to want more and more power and influence in its region. Whether it wants it globally is an interesting question. China is also a very different power from the United States or Britain. And this may be for better or worse. The United States and Britain have always had an idea of extending their influence by converting the locals to their cause. There's always been a sense that you could make the places that they have influence over more like them. So you go into Iraq and you say, we're going to make it a democracy. We're going to make it an open market economy. And this was the aspiration everywhere. And it comes, I think, out of a kind of high Protestant tradition in which you think, Christianity has this great universal proselytizing mission. The Chinese have no such conception of their world role. The Chinese do not believe that they could go into any country in the world and ever make it like China, because guess what? Those people are not Chinese. China has an ethno-nationalist conception of its world role. What it means for China to be great is not that the world becomes communist or quasi-communist or Chinese capitalist or anything like that. It means that you respect China. You kowtow to China, and I'm using the word advisedly because it comes from the Chinese tradition. So the question India has to ask itself is, does it want to kowtow to China? Does it want to become part, a satellite of an ever-expanding zone of Chinese influence? By the way, I'm not saying at this point anything about the Chinese are going to be aggressive, they're going to invade countries. That I don't know. The Chinese are in some ways too smart to do what Vladimir Putin did. But I do think there's no question that they expect extraordinary respect and deference, even obedience. And you only see the way that they deal with a country like Australia, where the 14 demands, or I can't remember, it was 10 or 14 demands that they made of Australia, included that Australian media should refrain from criticizing China. Australian think tanks should no longer publish studies that are critical of China's domestic policy on any issue. These are unusual, to say the least, demands for an outside country to make. And what was essentially the Chinese were saying is, the price of our good economic relations with us is that we expect these kinds of things. Australia is a much richer country than India, so it would stand to reason that over time the Chinese will make those kinds of demands of India. I don't think India will accept them, but the question is then, if you're not going to accept them, how are you positioning yourself geopolitically to be able to withstand that, play that, take advantage of it, buy insurance, cushion yourself? Surely the answer is not that you're going to get 90% of your advanced weaponry from China's great satellite vassal state, Russia. That doesn't make any sense.
Well, that's exactly the question I think most Indians sitting in this audience ask themselves. We've had trouble with China on the borders. They've been extremely aggressive. What happens if China moves further into our borders, takes over more Indian territory? Will the world come to India's aid? You can't depend on Russia, who will probably cut off arms supplies at that stage. Where does that leave India? Because that's, I think, the nightmare scenario for everyone here.
Well, look at how Zelensky has handled it, if you want a sense of why it has worked. I think one of the most extraordinary aspects of this conflict, by the way, has been the degree to which it has revealed a kind of new world that we live in. A world in which everyone is wired, everyone has a cell phone, and so the world is really seeing this Russian invasion of Ukraine largely through Ukrainian eyes, because the Ukrainians are, middle-income country. Everybody has a cell phone, everybody has a story to tell, and they have at the helm a brilliant political strategist, at least at the level of communication. I mean, think about what Zelensky has done, right? He's used the power of media to address live the United States Congress, the British Parliament, the German Bundestag, the Japanese Parliament, and to each one, by the way, he has a different message. Yeah. He says to the Americans, you are the world leader, how can you let this happen? To the British, he says, we are like you were in 1941. We are all alone. I am like Churchill, I need your help. To the German Bundestag, he says, you should be ashamed of yourself for buying gas from the Russians. To the Japanese, he says, they are attacking Chernobyl and you're going to get another Fukushima on a global stage. So he's pressing the button of each country and each national culture in a brilliant way. And this has mobilized people, but his central message is, we are a free democratic people. We want to be part of the free democratic world. Please help us, right? We are dying for you because we all have the same cause. He was on my show for the entire show 2 weeks ago, and he said, the only message I have for you is, we are dying for you. We are dying for the freedoms you believe in. When are you going to help us, right? India needs to, in order to get the kind of response Zelensky is getting, India needs to decide, where does it stand on some of these issues? Where does it stand on the strategic divide? Where does it stand in terms of the issue of being part of the open world, the free world, or the increasingly authoritarian cabal that Russia, China, Iran, Venezuela, to a certain extent, represent? And again, I think Indian society has a very clear answer to that, but I don't think New Delhi does.
I'm talking about fears of people in this room. Here's our other fear. You have on your western border Pakistan, which is a hostile neighbor, and you make it more hostile by raising the temperature every time you need something domestically for political gains. On your eastern side, you have China, which is probably going to be the next big, great superpower. And when you have a problem with two hostile neighbors and you look at the rest of the world, are you going to go to America, who, when Ukraine happened, asked you to help and you said, well, listen, this is not our fight, we're not getting involved? Where does that leave us?
It's an even broader question than what you're asking, Veer, because I think India needs to get serious about foreign policy. It is still relegated to a kind of, it's still largely relegated to a kind of subordinate issue. I've been struck by the transformation that I've seen in the time that I've been in the United States between Chinese diplomats on the one hand and Indian diplomats on the other. Indian diplomats at the very highest level, even not at the stratospheric level of Shashi Tharoor, but even at the more, the kind of sub-stratospheric range, are very, very good. But what I've been struck by is the Chinese utterly transformed their diplomatic service so that 30 years ago, you used to meet incompetent socialist bureaucrats who knew very little about the world, basically spoke Chinese, didn't know how to interact with you. Now, these people are smart, they are sharp, they are media savvy. The ones that need to speak English, the ones that need to speak French or German speak it. And there are many of them. I believe the number is per capita, China has 5 times as many diplomats as India does. 5 times as many per capita, not just because they are larger. If you go to the WTO headquarters and you look at the size of the Chinese delegation there, I believe it is larger than the actual secretariat of the WTO itself. And so when people say China cheats on trade, it's actually not true. The Chinese game world trade brilliantly. They have studied it, they have mastered it. Everything they do, they have exploited some loophole. They have a theoretical rationale for it. They argue their cases effectively. India largely just sits back. And, there needs to be a much more forward-leaning effort to try and figure out how do we take advantage of these opportunities? How do we, because, India has to hustle on the world stage. And you don't get that feeling. You get the feeling of an inwardly, sometimes I think of India as kind of the Ottoman Empire, sitting around, lots of diversity, turmoil internally, and entirely obsessed with that, not noticing that there's a world out there which is actually having a big impact on it. And by the way, the story doesn't end so well for the Ottoman Empire.
Okay. I'm going to throw this open, but before that, one question, because I know everyone wants the answer to this. You refer to the Ukraine situation and what it would entail as being plastic. It could go either way. Can you game us one or two ways how you think it could go?
Sure. So I think, as I say, what people are imagining in both sides, in Ukraine and Russia, is, we win, one side says, and the other says, no, we will win. Those things happen very rarely. If you look at the history of war, most wars end in a very complicated, messy, negotiated settlement where both sides feel deeply unhappy. There is a kind of status quo that is formalized. One can call it a line of control. One can call it the DMZ, right? Those are the realities. Those are the real endings to wars. I'll give you an example of the kind of thing I'm talking about. The United States and North Korea, negotiated for 2 years while the Korean War continued, and thousands of Americans and tens of thousands of Koreans were dying over the issue of exchange of prisoners of war at the end of the war. 2 years the Korean War went on, longer than it needed to. So imagine, for people imagining this is going to somehow, we're going to quickly negotiate this, the world is going to go back to normal, I think it's highly unlikely. And that's why I say I think these sanctions, or large parts of them, stay on, the decoupling stays on, the high energy prices will stay on. So, you will get to some eventual settlement that I believe is likely to look something like this. The Russians will keep Crimea, of course. They will keep a larger part of eastern Ukraine than they had at the start. They want, I know from the negotiations taking place, they want to take it almost as far as Odessa, including the cities like Mariupol. The Ukrainians are dead set against this, but the Ukrainians will not accept this. So there will be some kind of legalized fiction where the Ukrainians will say this is our territory, the Russians will say it's our territory, but they will agree to stop fighting over it. And there will be a kind of gray zone where these countries will be regarded by the Ukrainians, these regions will be regarded by the Ukrainians as theirs, they will be regarded by the Russians as theirs. And then the question is, what happens to the international order that has fractured? I think in that scenario, which is the most likely scenario, because I cannot see the Russians withdrawing from eastern Ukraine, let alone Crimea. In that scenario, Western sanctions may be dialed back, but they will not come off. Russia will still be substantially isolated from the world economy, which means it will move fairly substantially into China's orbit, which means that you begin this process of a kind of divergence and bifurcation. I really don't even think it's 3 zones, Montek, or somebody was saying, I think it was Shankar, there is no third zone. I mean, the non-Chinese, non-US zone doesn't exist. What is it going to be? The rupee as the third reserve currency of the world? No, I mean, there are really just 2 options. And it in some ways would be clarifying for India to understand that. You either go with China's alternative, or you go with the zone of the West. Those are your choices.
So I know I said last question, but one more. Why, given all this, do you think Putin invaded? What did he hope to achieve?
It's a very good question, Veer, because he in many ways had achieved what he wanted just by the build-up. I know for a fact that the Chancellor of Germany and the Prime Minister of Great Britain both told Putin point blank, Ukraine is not going to become a member of NATO. Now, I fault Western diplomacy over the last 10 years, starting with Bush and that Bucharest Declaration, in irresponsibly dangling the prospect of NATO membership in front of Ukraine, when it was perfectly clear that was not going to happen. So they did enough to enrage Putin and not enough to secure Ukraine, which strikes me as a cardinal diplomatic sin. But Putin had gotten the world's attention. He had gotten the great powers to basically tell him de facto this is not going to happen, but we are not going to publicly say, as a matter of principle, that any country is disallowed from ever being part of NATO, because it's a voluntary association. It's not meant to be one of these places that by law or by decree says somebody is not going to be in it. So if that was his principal concern, that was satisfied. So there are two other possibilities. One, that the best way to think about this is actually not a great power conflict between the West and Russia, but as a process of decolonization that was delayed because of Russia's collapse. So at the end, when France loses World War II, it begins the process of decolonization. And it says we will never let Algeria go. The only problem is the Algerians want to go, right? And this produces a messy, very complicated decolonization. Eventually, they have to let it go. Britain does the same with Kenya. Because of Gandhi and Nehru, the Indian one worked out well, though God knows it could have been very, very messy in that scenario. But Kenya was extremely messy. People often forget Britain killed 1 million Kenyans in the decolonization of Kenya. Ukraine is in some sense Russia's Algeria, a country that for Putin is so closely identified with Russian identity, with the idea of Russian-speaking people, with Slavic unity, that he cannot conceive of a great Russia without Ukraine as part of it. Now you say this is irrational, we live in the modern world, but remember how the French thought about Algeria.
Yeah.
And remember that the majority of the French, even when de Gaulle stopped the Algerian war, were against him. It was only de Gaulle who could do it because he was so wildly popular. The vast majority of Frenchmen still wanted to hold on to Algeria. So I think there's something like that going on here. There is a kind of national greatness project where Ukraine is part of that. And the final point is, remember, Vladimir Putin wields power of a kind almost nobody does in the world. If Xi Jinping dies tomorrow, we know what will happen. There is an institutional structure that governs China. The Standing Committee of the Politburo will get together. They will vote. Somebody else will be appointed. That person will become president of China. If the king of Saudi Arabia dies, we know what will happen. The crown prince will become the monarch. What happens if Vladimir Putin dies in Russia? Nobody knows. It is, as the Russians describe it, a vertical of power. There's one man running, the country with the largest number of nuclear weapons in the world. It's all dependent on this one man, and he's been in that position for 22 years. Yeah. My point is, if Lord Acton was right and power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, we have the case here. Putin has wielded power for a longer time than anyone on the world stage today. He has wielded absolute power. Who knows what, you live in a world of courtiers for 22 years. You have only people telling you how great you are. You have people telling you that the Ukrainians are really Russians, that they will greet you with roses. Maybe he's gone power mad. I put that as the third possibility because I am always wary to personalize these things too much. But it does seem to be a very personal, emotional decision for Putin, and I suspect that he made it very much himself.
It could be a combination of 2 and 3.
Exactly.
2 is where he's thinking emotionally rather than rationally, and 3, he's not in a position to be very rational anyway. Yeah?
Exactly.
Yeah? Okay, I'm going to open this up. We have a little time. Shashi, while other people are thinking of questions, you want to ask something? No? You sure? All right. Okay. Yes, the gentleman there on table number 3.
So Farid, you said about one of your show that the 5-finger dispute at Doklam, that because of that India went to Quad. Now, if there is a China policy of India, what it should be according to you?
I couldn't hear the question.
Yeah, I missed
Yeah,
it too.
Okay. The dispute that happened in Doklam with China, which led to India moving to Quad. Now, according to you, what should be India's China policy? Because India is at one point of time looking at a larger conflict, which was averted last year.
Right.
Okay.
So I will tell you what I think India's broader policy should be for its own national interests. India should develop a very powerful strategic relationship with the United States that is economic, technological, nuclear, and political. India should say to the United States, if you want to have a real relationship with us, here are the things we want. We want you to sell us your most advanced weaponry. We want you to help us develop an even more powerful nuclear deterrent. We want greater openness to trade and technology. We want to become the next Taiwan. If you're worried about a Taiwan, going the wrong way, you need to have an insurance policy. We can be the next Taiwan. We can be the next great manufacturer of semiconductor chips in the world, and we want technology flows and transfer flows like that. We want a people-to-people relationship that is so that our relationship is characterized, is more like the United States and Israel than the United States and Saudi Arabia. The United States and Saudi Arabia have a government-to-government relationship. Israel and the United States have a people-to-people relationship. India can construct on a much larger scale that kind of relationship. And if you put all that in place, I think you present China with a much more complicated strategic choice. And then the Chinese, I think, will ask themselves, for 20 square miles of frozen wasteland in the Himalayas, would it be worth, getting into a permanent antagonistic situation? And I would argue that they will make the rational choice that it actually won't. And so India will be able to maintain good trade relations with China as well. At this point, the Chinese have no reason to fear India. And the Indians have this, I really think it's very much a kind of head in the sand, 1950s Nehru, Hindu Chini Bhai Bhai approach. Like we somehow, how many times has Modi met with Xi, thinking that this great act of personal diplomacy is going to change Xi Jinping? The Chinese don't think that way. They are thinking very strategically about their expanding influence.
Okay. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Rohit. Farid, first of all, congratulations, a brilliant speak and a brilliant perspective. Really, very insightful. My question is to you, do you think the Balkanization of USSR was a good thing or a bad thing? And in either case, whatever your answer is, I would like to know why.
Yeah, look, I think I understand what you're saying. There was a kind of stability that existed when you had the Soviet Union, and what happened afterwards has produced a great deal of turmoil, right? Here's the problem. When you take that perspective, you are taking the perspective of the great powers, and you're forgetting that they're actually human beings living in all these countries. So when people say, the United States should never have expanded NATO, and I say this as somebody who was skeptical and cautious about how much and where and when the US should, and I always thought Ukraine was a bridge too far. But here's the problem. All those countries in the Soviet Union and in the Soviet sphere were utterly traumatized by Soviet domination. Remember, this is not like just losing a war to a country. For 45 years, these countries were dominated politically, culturally, socially from Moscow, totally against their will, right? When they escaped that domination in the early 1990s, they are desperate for some ability to buy insurance against a reconquest, a recolonization, a redomination by Moscow. So they're running around like crazy asking for support and security. What would you have said to them? No, it'll be better for global stability if you just go back into the Russian domination and just leave us alone, right? That was our choice. So it's not an easy, and I say this, your question is a very good one, because there was an element of instability produced by this. But the element of instability is produced by free people wanting to be free. And I, for one, cannot place myself in a position of saying that that is a bad thing. You know, I would rather try to navigate that world and produce as much stability as I can. You can see this in Ukraine, right? The easiest thing for Ukrainian stability would be to just shut up and become part of Moscow's empire. But they're saying we're willing to die not to do that. Okay. You know, it seems like it would be to dishonor them to say, no, we side with the Russian view of stability rather than your view of freedom.
Okay. Are there any women who want to ask questions? I'm getting tired of all these privileged middle-aged men getting up. Yes, the lady there, please. This lady behind you. Please give her the mic. Yeah.
I've been waiting for my turn.
Yeah.
Thanks. Fareed, I noticed that, when we were talking about positioning India and how we lack a strategy, it's very unique that not even once in our discourse we brought Pakistan anywhere. I just want to understand from you that if we have an aggressive China at our borders, what is that going to do to India's worries vis-a-vis Pakistan? And do they stand to gain from this aggression at our borders?
Okay.
Well, it's a very good question because it relates to this point that India is not thinking through this. Well, Pakistan has made its strategic choice. It has allied itself with China. That decision has been made. It's over. That relationship is only going to grow deeper and deeper. And the Chinese are going to use Pakistan as a way to maintain a certain degree of whether it's instability, control, influence, leverage, call it what you will, but that is going to be a part of China's India strategy. I think that the relationship is particularly strong because the Pakistani military still essentially controls Pakistan. And so I think that while there is a reality that the current Indian government is not particularly open to peace overtures with Pakistan, and I would fault them for that. I don't think there's much space there right now because of the Chinese factor as you describe it. So all the more reason if India faces this choice in a situation where it knows where Pakistan stands, it knows what China is doing, the question then it has to ask itself is how is it going to respond? How is Delhi going to respond to this? That force that you're describing is only going to increase over time, not decrease.
The gentleman, the very enthusiastic gentleman there.
Rafiq bhai, thank you. Thank you.
I've recognized the gentleman behind you. I will come to you, but I don't want the first two tables to ask every question. Yes.
Thank you, Veer. Fareed, brilliant talk. My name is Makarand, and my question is, do you think Xi Jinping will move on Taiwan, seeing that the West was unable to prevent Ukraine? And a follow-up, there's a counter-argument to India's moving into the US sphere of influence made by Kishore Mehbubani and others that India made a wrong choice in the first Cold War by siding with Russia. So they shouldn't make the wrong choice in the second Cold War by siding with the losing party, which would be the US. Thank you.
So on the first one, I wonder about, look, nobody knows, but I think the Chinese are more strategic than the Russians. I think that China has a genuine quandary on its hands with Taiwan. So I don't minimize the possibility. The Chinese strategy toward Taiwan was always, this is going back to Deng Xiaoping, was that time was on their side. That the growth of the Chinese economy would act as a kind of magnet that would slowly draw Taiwan into its orbit, and that over time, there would be inevitable that Taiwan would essentially become one more province of China. And this was encouraged in a sense by the thought that it could look a lot like Hong Kong, one country, two systems. Well, the problem is that China has moved in a very different way, and that Hong Kong no longer is one country, two systems, it's really one country, one system. So the response in Taiwan has been growing assertiveness and independence away from China. China's strategy was premised on the idea that there was a pro-mainland section of Taiwan, which was very substantial. The old KMT, the large ruling, what was for a long time the ruling party. But Taiwan has changed domestically very sharply. It is much more pro-independence. It is much more pro-autonomy at the very least. All younger voters are actually even more inclined in that direction. The small opposition party, the DPP, has now become the ruling party and shows no signs of being dislodged. So time is no longer on China's side. They're asking themselves, what will it look like 20 years from now? And it's very likely it'll look that Taiwan is even more independence-minded. So they have a problem. But I don't agree with you that they look at what is happening and say, this is a reason to do it. They're looking at what is happening and seeing the West was able to isolate and decouple the 11th largest economy in the world almost entirely. This is weaponizing interdependence that the United States was able to do. And it turns out the costs are much higher the more interdependent you are. So when you weaponize interdependence and sanction Venezuela or North Korea or even Iran, it has minimal effects because these countries are not participating in the international economic system anyway. But Russia was a fairly active participant, and that's why suddenly the shock of what has happened is and the havoc it's wreaking on the Russian economy is real. Now, China is much more interdependent than Russia is. So were the United States to be able to weaponize interdependence on China, that would be a seismic shock. And I think that China understands that the invasion of Taiwan could be an event for which, the Europeans would go along, the Australians would go along, even the Indians might go along on that one, right? So there's a very high stakes game for the Chinese, and they have tended to be cautious. They have tended to be practical. They have tended to be pragmatic on these kinds of things. So I would suspect that they're actually thinking more carefully. And by the way, they're also noticing the Ukrainians can put up a hell of a fight. And the Taiwanese have a better army than the Ukrainians do. So, that is, and I'm sorry I forgot your second question. Oh, they decline, yeah. Look, people have been saying that the United States is declining ever since the late 19th century. All I will say is, every 10 or 15 years, it looks like some other country is going to outstrip the United States. In the 1930s, it was the fascist powers, Germany. People forget, but that was the argument, that the United States was collapsing, the Great Depression, the financial crisis, and look at how Germany had put Germany back to work. Mussolini had the trains running on time. Didn't quite work out that way. Then in the 50s, people said the Soviet Union was going to do it. Look at the space race. They were sending people into space. They were growing faster. Khrushchev comes to the UN, takes his shoe off and says, we will bury you. You know how that worked out. Think about the 1980s. Everyone said Japan is going to take over the world. By the way, the people who were most convinced by this were the United States. The American commentary is flooded with this stuff. I was at Harvard at the time getting my PhD. One of my professors, Ezra Vogel, wrote a book called Japan as Number One, Living in a New World. It was meant to be our advice, how we should learn how to, all eat sushi and bow. Didn't quite work out that way. People now say China is going to do it. Let's see. I think that, trees don't grow to the sky. China has had a good 40 years. It now faces very complicated, challenging conditions. Its growth is slowing. Its population is moving into reverse gear. It's actually going to experience actual population decline. I'm not somebody who thinks China will collapse, by the way. But I think, the moving from middle income status to high income status is a very tough challenge. A lot of countries make it in that first, they go from $200 per capita GDP to $2,000 or $3,000 or $4,000. But going from 4,000 to 24,000, there are very few countries that have done it. Japan, Taiwan, South Korea. And if you want to add tiny places like Hong Kong, Singapore. But it's really 3 countries of any size in the world, okay? Maybe China is going to do it. But I wouldn't count the United States out. And I think that at the end of the day, my broader argument would be, it'll be powerful enough. You don't always need to be on the side of the person who, quote unquote, wins or is the number one. The coalition of the United States, Europe, Japan, Australia, that's a fairly large zone of advanced industrial countries. And they're also a zone of countries who share India's basic political ideas of freedom, liberty, individualism, diversity. I mean, what is India if not the greatest experiment in managing diversity in the world? right? And for it to not recognize that and put its values, put its heart where its head should be. I think that there's a way to do the right thing, but also to affirm your values in this case.
Okay. Last question of the day, sir, finally.
Yeah, thanks. Farid Bhai, I've been a big admirer of you. I've known the family. Rafiq Bhai, who was a great Indian politician and Islamic scholar. Your mother, late Fatima Ji, was also a known media person. You make us proud, you make the country proud being an Indian, and when you ask certain tough questions to the American presidents and the top leaders of the world globally, so you certainly make youngsters like us very, very proud. But now at this point in time, when we understand at times the levels of media, the level of journalism, and you yourself are a very, very accomplished journalist, known worldwide, for the way you handled situations, the tight situations, and knowing that your mother was also, I think, a journalist, if I may understand whatever I know about Fatima Afa. But don't you ever think that in India sometimes, the Indian channels are very popular also globally. So sometimes, I know you've been asked, this is an out-of-the-way questions, Ukraine, China, these are some questions which a lot of them have asked and they're very interested in knowing that. But it's a very personal question to you. Would you ever sometimes decide to do up a channel or to host a program in some with the kind of boldness, with the kind of swiftness that you have in interviewing the world leaders? Would you ever think or imagine to have a channel, or would you ever do something with regards to journalism in your own country? Your parents have been very patriotic. They've done so much for India. Would you ever think to come back and do something like that? Sorry, it's a very personal question, but I've been an admirer.
All right.
No, not at all. And I'll give you a personal answer. You're right. I grew up in a household in which India's political future was the most important dinner table conversation. We didn't talk about what I had learned in school that day. We talked about what was going to happen to India, whether, what were its prospects. I remember still as a little child, my parents would listen, rather than listening to Bollywood songs, which they listened to plenty. But when the formal occasion or something important happened, they would play Jawaharlal Nehru's speeches. It's still, I can still remember, and I can still quote the entire Freedom at Midnight speech. And for them, this was their secular religion. My father once said to me, the most important choice he ever made in his life, he made as a teenager, which was as an Indian Muslim to decide to opt for Nehru's vision of a secular democracy rather than Jinnah's vision of religious nationalism, right? You said he was an Islamic scholar, and he was certainly schooled and learned in that area. But his scholarship was almost entirely about the Indian Muslim condition and the importance of Indian Muslims being secular and being integrating themselves into the fabric of India. For him, this was the paramount challenge that he wanted to navigate and overcome. So this was his life's work. So all of which is to just say to you, I have a very deep emotional, personal, political interest and commitment to India. So I don't want you to think when I tell you what I'm going to tell you that it comes from a lack of interest. But I don't think you can participate in the political life of a country sitting 6,000 miles away without the deep knowledge you need to understand it. I think that I wouldn't be able to be very effective. I think that what Amir has done using his platform and is a much more powerful version of anything that I could ever do. Not just because he's brilliant and because he's a Bollywood star and all that, but because he's deeply rooted in these issues. He knows it, he lives it. It is his country at the end of the day. And I have to admit, honestly, that while I have great affection for India, I have, deep personal association. It isn't my country in that sense. And I would be an imposter in that situation. So what I can do is to offer the kind of advice I do from the outside, and to wish people who are doing great work, as I said, like the ABP, like independent media everywhere, and people like Ahmed. The important thing is to just keep doing it and to remember, it looks like a struggle, and it seems that there's all these pressures, but the truth is there is enormous vitality in Indian society, and everything changes. Every time you think that there is a new dispensation that is going to go on forever, the great thing about a democracy is it changes. It doesn't look like that 10 years from now. India will look different 10 years from now. In some ways better, in some ways worse, but different. And your job is to make sure that that core of Indian values, ideals that have stood true for it, from 1947, continue. And this is one of the things that I think India can be proud of, no matter what, whether you get, one or two reforms right or wrong, whether you get GST right or wrong. 100 years from now, no one's going to remember that stuff in the history books. But they will remember if you preserve or destroy Indian democracy.
Thank you. That was so brilliant and such a nice note to end this on. Thank you. Big hand for Fareed Zakaria.
Well, the applause really says it all. I need not say anything more, but what a masterclass in international relations and geopolitics. Thank you, Mr. Zakaria, for that. I'd like to invite Avinash Pandey, ABP Network CEO, to present a token of our gratitude to Mr. Zakaria. A round of applause, ladies and gentlemen. Also for Mr. Sanghvi for once again such a fantastic conversation.